help us, let's see what we will focus on today. We're looking at the buying organization, what it would look like, the typical structures that you'll encounter once you've identified the organization. Most common buying processes, how does it work, who does what, and there are the psychologies and the motivations of the buyers and the buying team, and a bit of tips and tricks to respond to them. Just a quick recap for our benefit for the last session on how to identify the cluster that you would go after in a B2B segment or market. We went through what is B2B, why is it important to find B2B markets, and what makes it different. And finally, which is the big piece, was how to identify your target institution or cluster. Okay, so let's jump into today's topics. So we'll take a quick look at what's happening behind the scenes at your target organization. So we have identified the target organization from the work that we did on Friday. And we will look at a couple of things that work behind the scenes, because what is behind the scenes actually affects you as to the kind of sale or the process of sale that's going to happen over there. So as with any business, a typical business or an institution, they have multiple priorities. Though from the outside it looks like, oh, everybody wants to make money, or they want to do a particular service, like in a government institution. Inside the workings, there are multiple priorities. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they work against each other. That also happens. And there is always a push for performance, whether it comes from the inside or from the outside. In terms of listed companies, there is a stock market, there is competition. In terms of government, there is a whole bunch of stakeholders who will be pushing them for performance and asking them to share the details of their performance. All the time, the typical business would be responding to the internal and external stakeholders. So internal and external, when we talk about that, it is people and regulators inside and outside, which we all know about. But at the same time, there are other stakeholders who will be looking at the workings and performance of a typical business. If your product or service addresses one department, there are multiple departments asking them what's going on, how can you help, why you're not doing this, why you're doing this, all of that continues to happen. If your product or service addresses the manufacturing, the sales will have something to say. If it is about sales, the accounting will have something to say, and a lot of things that happen as well. And within all of this, the business of doing business, for getting their day-to-day going, there's a lot of activity that happens with respect to customers, their supply chains, governance, and things like that. So there's a lot of action happening inside your business. It is not as static and not as structured or as peaceful or straightforward as we would expect it or we would like it to be. So given this context, why would they listen to you? So you have come with a product or service, why would they listen to you? These are typically 4 reasons. There may be other reasons temporarily, but these are typically 4 reasons. Your product is a key input to their product or service, which means that if you are a business that is looking at some purification process for salt, and it's very critical to bring up the salt packet, then obviously your product is a key input to bringing out salt packets. So salt may seem like, oh, what's there? It's just a piece of salt and you put it inside a packet and you sell it. It's not necessarily so. Your product is a key input to their product. If you're a service, let's say that you are a tax audit service, and for governance they have to go through you. You're a critical input to their service. Your service is critical input to their business. Then you have a little bit of a power position over there, because come tax time, you are one of the people that is going to help them sort out their governance and get them to have a hassle-free business cycle. Next is your product reduces their risks. A risk, as we know, we think of insurance. Insurance is one such service, but by assuring supply chain, you may reduce the risk. So that's one service. By giving information about where the product or service is sourced, That is also reducing risk. So if I'm a coffee shop and I'm telling people that my coffee comes from these kinds of gardens, your service could be something that authenticates it. It's not just claim, but it says that, okay, I can tell you that the coffees that you made from May of 2019 to December of 2019 came from these 7 gardens. So it's an information. It's a sort of probably a IT enabled service which gives reduces the risk to the market of your client. Thirdly, your service improves efficiency. In production lines, you may have software that helps people monitor quality. It tracks cost overruns so that they can respond to it much more easily. It may be just a training service that you're talking about, which may seem simple on the outside, but once it is done, it actually helps customer service. So your services are less costly and more effective. Then finally, the big one, your product or service brings them more customers, and that is what a lot of companies would like. Like I buy this, or I take up this service, and suddenly my market is open. So it can be something like a marketing campaign organization. It can be an advertising organization. It can be something like packaging. It can be something that helps a consultancy that helps you certify. If you talk about the organic food market, moment you get certified, the markets open up a little bit more and gets you more customers. So these are some of the typical reasons why a business will look at you. Uh, so then we look at who is inside. So we're looking at behind the scenes in your client or your potential client organization. And this is typical. The squares may be one person, maybe more than one person, maybe a department, depending upon the size of the purchase that they're going to make, the way that they operate. If you look at my favorite example is Indian Railways, which is like huge, has many different kinds of presence across the country. They may have a different way of organizing their purchase. Vis-a-vis like a smaller organization, say local to Bangalore, which is talking about, say, a taxi service or something like that, which though both are in transport, the way that they buy would be different. Then the squares are representative of the typical way that finally an organization process will go through. There may be variations based on the industry. So look at this. There is the user or the budget holder. This is the person who puts up his or her hand and says, "Oh, for us to run this, I need Y." So if I'm running, we talked about the tax audit. So we say that, okay, this year we have that many more products. So I, as a user, I'm putting up my hand and saying, come 2021, I need an independent tax audit service. And I think that this is the budget I can afford. And that is the way I, as a department head, I put up. And there may be an influencer or an expert advice that I'm getting, which may be official or unofficial. There may be somebody in place who understands all about tax audit and says, okay, you need to look at this kind of firm. Or there may be something that they're reading online, or have heard online or read somewhere that's offering them expert advice. Then there are the front end people who will tell you, okay, this is how the requirement needs to be specified. This is the way we work. If I'm going to take a tax audit service, then that means that you have to be with me from day one, so that your people come and look at our systems and processes and give us comments on it month on month. So that's a functional reviewer who says, oh, this is the kind of auditor that we need. And then the actual person who signs the contract from the department, it may be the user. So small enough things in organizations, the user and the buyer may be the same person or the same department. In larger systems, they are very much different. In fact, for to avoid any kind of conflict of interest, larger organizations keep these two separate. Your user and your buyer, probably separate people, maybe even separate departments. I have put the purchase department as a gray square somewhere on the right. This is definitely any kind of buying, as from a medium to a large organization. They have a completely separate, distinct department to enable purchase processes, and there will be some internal cycle going on between the user and the purchase department before any of these things can happen. There is something called purchase operations, which is the person who will send out requirement maybe, or collect the responses. We'll talk about the terms and conditions, and probably even have a vendor onboarding process that they have put up. So this is a very complicated and but fairly typical process. And we'll see next as to how this affects you when you're going to sell. So let's look at, take a minute. This is time for you to kind of do a little bit of work. Do you know what these roles are in your target company? Do you know where they operate? Do they have a purchase department? Do you know whether the buyer is the same as the user? How do you and your organization and your sales effort have you done your homework to make sure that you've got this mapped out? I'm going to put the slide back so you get a sense, but please take a few minutes and write down and see what have you got. Yeah. So here what you need to do is think through, note down, do you know how to reach them? You may not be able to in all organizations, it's fine. Just think about your target group or your target company and see where you are with that. Okay, moving on. So here is where the drama begins, right? I think I want you to understand this, that there's a lot of back-end dynamic that happens, which you may not even be aware of, but be aware that there is a lot of interaction that happens. The bigger the purchase, the bigger the numbers, the bigger the input impact into their business, the bigger the drama. And I don't mean drama in a very derogatory sense, but there is a lot of activity, there's a lot of discussion, there are a lot of decisions, there are counter pressures and counter pressures. So here we look at how do you track the dynamics. Now there are different ways that the dynamics are affected. One is the role and responsibility. We talked about the purchase department. They have a role and responsibility. Then we have the functional requirement assessment people. They have their role and responsibility. The buyers themselves. If you look at the garment industry, I think we hear a lot about the power of the buyers in the garment industry as to how they get to decide a lot. They are not necessarily just the people who place the order. That generally is a purchasing, but the buyer is an expert in his or her domain. The buyer comes and says, okay, I think this is the kind of thing that I would like to display or I would like to go with in my retail firm coming the ahead of the season. They keep a pulse. They understand the pulse of the market. So if you look at food produce as well, they'll be able to tell you, oh, I think this works in that market. So therefore, this is the kind of partnering that I want. This is the kind of vendor that I want. So if you look at spicy food, doesn't sell in northwest or wherever, whereas sweet things sell more. So this is a very simplistic way of putting, but they have a pulse and the trend of the market, and that's their responsibility and role. This is for the buyer. Formal and informal dependencies. So they would have the functional dependency. Just because I'm the buyer, I cannot go and buy whatever it is I want. I have an organization behind me which offers a budget, which offers a process by which I have to follow. That's a very formal dependency. So there is approval processes. And then there are informal dependencies. The informal dependencies happen because of certain power dynamics inside. So if I'm a very new buyer in an existing organization, though I may be very smart and clever in my work, I may not be able to say that this is the kind of vendor I want to go to because I need to tread carefully. There is already an existing process. So that's an informal dependency. If I were purchasing manager who is has been with the company for long, but there has been a takeover, then I need to be able to uh, establish that I am able to get the best deals possible for the company. There is my public record, but the conviction will happen only as I move along. So there is that informal dependency within the organization. Okay. Then there's official and personal objective. Which we all know, right? When we wear a hat of a CEO, our CEO role tells us about certain things that we want as a CEO, but we are very well aware that our personal objectives might mean that, that perhaps something like I would like to travel less and get more out of my travel. So that could be a very simplistic way of looking at it. In a larger organization, I may want a promotion, so therefore I am willing to take more risks this time. Whereas officially, my role will be taking less risks. So this year, I may feel that I may want to take a big jump. So I want to take a little bit more risks, whereas officially I'm not I may be touching the boundaries of my risk profile there. And third is individual and organizational risk appetite. As we know, so we all have a personal risk appetite. So sometimes they may say, okay, I think I'm convinced that this vendor is going to deliver, so I'm going to go and sign off on the order. But there may be people there who will say, no, I think you're okay, but I want you to talk to X and Y so that when I know that I'm presenting this to my management, I have the opinion of two more people. That's an individual risk appetite. Then organizational risk appetite, organizations which are powerful will say, okay, I'm going to give you 70% of my intake this year. That's fine, because I know that if you're not going to deliver, I have vendors 3, 4, 5, and 6 standing in line in my lobby every day. If you're not delivering, I just call them and they'll deliver. That's the organizational risk appetite. So this also depends upon the kind of product and service that you're offering. If it is close to their core um, input for a critical, like the salt example that I gave, then their organizational risk appetite might not be as flexible. But if it is something like a support activity or a service, they may be a little bit more flexible when it comes to organizational risk. And we know the current external conditions, there's a lot of risk out there. People are not able to make decisions. This kind of clouds over the whole dynamic. Even in this, there are people who are optimistic and say, yeah, all of this will pass. And then there are people who say, no, we'll have to live with this. So let us plan for that. So this also affects the dynamics. So here, back to you to look at what is the risk, what are the dynamics that you see and what you have seen in your target organizations. This is something you may have experienced or you are aware of from your reading to say, okay, this is how my target companies or my target organization behaves. Okay. So let's look at each of those roles and their motivations. So this will give us uh, some idea as to how to move forward when we are going into the organization and having those sales conversations. So this is what we saw earlier. We saw the user, the influencer expert, the functional reviewer, the buyer, the purchase operations folks, and somewhere in the back is the purchase department. So their official role has certain expectations, what they are looking for. So the user obviously wants value for money. A user wants it to work and has a budget and is willing to kind of pay a little, maybe more, if the value is good. The purchase department sometimes may align with that, but at times they also say that I have the goal of keeping all expenses down. So all my purchases have to be within this. So each offer that is there, I need to keep my final buying price between 10 and 15%. And they have KRAs which say that. So you will either have 15% less or 20%, and they have slabs all over. So this is something that you need to be aware of as to what is the slab that you fall under for your product or service. Then the influencer and the expert wants the product or service that you're offering to be in sync with his or her opinion or idea, because they are the experts after all, and you cannot, your product or service, you have to convince either through the user or through the buyer that the product or service is in sync with their philosophy, their opinion of what it should look like, what it should do, and how it should be presented. Depending upon the product and service, there will be a lot more criteria that they will work with. The functional reviewers are into process. They have a set process. They understand that. They have discussed that with the user or the influencer, and sometimes even with the purchase department. So they have a process. Stick to that and help them make their job easy. The buyer has a job to do, and sometimes is also an influencer when we talked about industries like fashion, because they understand what's going around. Be aware that the buyer also interacts with your competitors a lot. So listen to them very carefully as to what it is that they are saying. Purchase operations, we covered that. It is about the process. Now that is the functional, the official role, and we all know. Uh, Sometimes the designation will tell you, sometimes the person will tell you, for this project, this is what I'm doing. So there is opportunity to know a lot about this internal structure, but not always. So you may not know, for example, what is the bandwidth that the purchase department has signed down to say that if I'm going to buy an ERP system, this is the bandwidth that we are okay with. If I'm going to buy office equipment, this is the bandwidth that I'm okay with. That you may not know very clearly. But if you build relationships somewhere here, you may get hints. And again, if it's very high value, you will be interacting many, many times. So more opportunities for you to talk to them. If it is a 1 or 2 time purchase, then listen very carefully what they're saying. What is not known is the personal goals and interpersonal dynamics. Very rarely you may get to hear. So if you have had time to go into the organization and talk to people and make those relationships, you may get to hear that perhaps influencer expert is looking to become the CIO for the organization, or is going to become the chief scientific officer, or something in that category. Therefore, they uh, want to see something positive happen in this particular project. So some such gossip, some such input you may get to hear, but not all. So keep an ear open. That does make a difference. And when you're talking about presenting your point of view, your product, and your service to organizations, there may be times that it may not work very well to talk about one to the other, even in a very professional sense. So be careful as to where this is going with the whole process. Are you supporting one person vis-a-vis the other? This is a very, I'm going to give you a little tip here. A lot of the times the user will not perhaps be in sync with the purchase, or they will say, I mean, that's a completely different department, I don't know what is going on. You may finish all your negotiations here when you talk about the user and the influencer and the buyer and your functional process. All of that is done, but when you get to purchase, you are like, oh, I've finished my bottom level negotiations over there, didn't realize that you guys also have to negotiate. So this is a very typical thing, that and a lot of people I know are very shy of getting into the negotiation process of the purchasing. They're very comfortable here because they talk the same language, they're very interested, they understand the industry. But when it comes to purchase, but always remember that getting early on into the purchase process and giving them that space to negotiate and being upfront about it really helps in building a relationship. Sometimes purchase departments do vendor development also, depending upon the organization, and they will give you a call and say, I think we have a requirement coming up, even without the user actually initiating the conversation. So just be aware of those interpersonal and internal dynamics. Okay, so now how would you respond to each of these players? So this is, I gave you some thoughts on it while I was talking about this previous slide, but also for you to think through. In your own specific case, how would you respond to each of these uh, functional spots like the user, the expert, the buyer, and all of that? Think through a little bit. So at top level, and I want to reiterate, I think a lot of you are aware of this, but identifying your customer very clearly, who is that group, that person um, in the organization, who is the kind of organization that you're looking at. So here I have put in a couple of descriptions that I would like. The description of the customer cannot be just schools, CBSE schools. So if you ask somebody who's running programs for CBSE schools, uh, they may say, okay, my program actually works in CBSE schools. I think it makes a lot from the sales point of view to be very clear for this campaign, this approach, this process. Your customer is schools run by a corporate entity with a CBSE curriculum located in the town, whichever town that you're talking about, uh, or state or region with 20 odd branches or more. So make it as specific as that. Uh, then if you're looking at organizations, you're looking at employee engagement efforts, or you're looking at software for insurance or something like that, or your company does a SaaS program for expenses management. So you will have to say something like organizations that have employee strength of 1,000 or more on site. So the critical thing is, though there may be 1,000 employees, if they are like a taxi service which has many thousands of drivers but they are not on site, and your software is about attendance management or whatever it comes in, then you have to be very clear that your product or service is about having 1,000 plus employees on site, and that's where it will work. And if you look at retail, the last one, we are very clear about this. Is a retail clothing outlets catering to what kind of customer, located where, and what kind of product, and who will be wearing those clothes.
Gayatri,
Yes.
just 1 second. Some of them are having a problem seeing the PPT.
Huh.
Can you
Why?
just share it once? Because I can see it, but some of them are having a problem
Okay.
seeing the
Okay.
PPT.
Shall I should share again? I think
Yeah,
they may
yeah.
have come on. Okay. Will do.
No, they have been there. So if we can just start share
Okay.
again. Help. Should I?
Okay. Let me just see once again.
Yeah.
Share screen.
Should I share it for you? Would that work?
I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, we
Let
can
me
see
try.
it.
Let me try.
Yeah. We can see it now. If you can just,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that it's good now.
Others. Yeah.
Can
Okay.
everyone
So
see the PPT now?
did they miss anything?
Yeah, now it's fine. Yeah, they could hear you, Gayatri, so it's fine. We would move ahead. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, so the last one. So this is one thing that I want. Each time you're looking at a customer, the response inside should be about defining the customer. And this is probably slightly outside the scope of these two webinars, but this is something that I strongly believe that you need to be able to define your customer very clearly and to as much detail as possible. What examples I've given are obviously imagined examples. They are not something that I've heard from anybody, but if for your own self and for your own business, please do this. So next is going into the organization and how do you kind of take a stance? What kind of stance you take vis-a-vis the kind of products or service that you are offering? If your product is a key input to their product or service, you will become a consultative partner, which means that you can tell them that if you use like this is the kind of output that you will get. And you also have the expertise because you understand their processes very well, because it's a key input. So for example, if you are talking about soaps, and we talked about the coconut oil example, and it's a key input to their soap manufacturing process, you can tell them that this particular batch of coconut oil that you have has an emolument, not emolument. There is another word for it, which makes it fat content is so much, and therefore, once the fat content is so much, it gives you this kind of output in your soaps. If you So that's one way of looking at it. Your product reduces risks. So again, if your product is, let's say, talks about getting business risk out or production risk out, then you also have understanding of their business, their processes, internal and external. Therefore, you're an expert as well, and then you can go into a partnering stance. So you tell them your success is my success. So when I give you my product or service and you do very well, that's also shows for me. So therefore, I'm a partner in your success. So that's a stance you come with. And your service improves efficiency. Whenever you talk of efficiency and you talk about service improvements, you have to go in with a data oriented proof, which means that you know that if using your product or service, the percentage point as much close as possible, that you're able to tell them, to say that you will get improvement of efficiency by so much rupees, by so much product items, by so much customer percentage, any of those numbers that is relevant to your industry or their industry. Those numbers need to be the way that you will approach, and that's the way that you will have your conversations as well. And your product or service brings them more customers. Again, data oriented. Why will the translation, nothing needs to be lost in translation. How do you translate your product or service to increase number of customers for them? Yeah. So the data bit is very important. And secondly, also referrals. If you've had a proof of concept site, if you have done some work, that stance also has to come. So the way that you're orienting your own connection or interactions with the customers depends upon the way that your product or service works for your clients. So the consultative, expert, data oriented with proof, and data oriented with referrals. These are some of the stances that you can take. As you go to meet with each of these people, they will be having their own perspectives into these stances, and that is what you will also go with. Now, this seems a little confusing because if you can't wear multiple hats when you go, I'm hoping that you have a sales team or one or two people who will be working with these organizations. And when they interact with each of these levels, I think the conversation piece that needs to center is to have that stance first, and also respond to the dynamics of that role, the user, the influencer, the purchase department, and things like that. So it is institutional sales is not that simple. There is a lot of complexities involved, and be aware of that when we go there. Take time to reflect. I think one of the things that we advocate is when we go to an institutional sale or a B2B sale, you don't have to provide all the answers in each meeting. Yeah? You can always go back and say, okay, I'm going to take a look at this, come back and offer something that has more stickiness in your potential client. So the role level response, we talked about that many times in the last 3-4 slides. When you're the user, talking to the user, be benefit focused. Your responses and your deliverable have to sync with their deliverable. So if the system wants a tax audit by 2021, there is no point in you saying, oh, I'll have my team in maybe sometime in 2020, and then we'll see. That's a very wishy-washy answer, and that's not the way that you would also go. But please keep it very clear with your industry, with your product, with your service, what works in the language that works for them. And that's what we're talking about when you say they're syncing to their deliverables. The examples I'm giving you are definitely imaginary examples, but you get the gist of it. Next is buyer is their requirement oriented, so focus on the requirement. And here is where, as I said, they talk to a lot of your competitors. So they need to be able to differentiate in their mind that how is your product or service different from the 7 or 8 or 200 competitors out there. So keep highlighting your USP. And if you don't have a USP, it's high time that you built it. It may be a temporary price advantage that you're offering, but even that, it needs to be highlighted with the buyer, because that's the person who's going to carry information into the system. The influencer is where there's an expert, where there is an inside expert, then this works. Understand the philosophy. Why does the expert view a particular product or service that goes into the organization that way, and acknowledge their expertise? That is something that you will have to do with a one-to-one person. Not every sale or not every business has an influencer inside the organization. They may be external influencers. There may be blogs that they are reading, there may be newspaper articles, there may be white papers, there may be conferences that they've attended. Those also influence your purchase decision for an organization. In that cases, this is not applicable, but you still need to understand what has influenced. So therefore, you go back to the user and the buyer and understand what has been influencing them across. Purchase operations straightforward is they have boundaries. So understand the boundaries very clearly and sync to that process. When I say sync, it means that whatever you say or do is not asking them to take too wide risks. When you're doing a job for a company, you do not want to take that much personal risk unless it's clearly warranted, or there may be some kind of super special circumstances. Lastly is a functional piece, very much again process oriented. Here is the opportunity for you to package your information in such a way that it makes their job and task simple, and your way of presenting is not challenging the way that they have been doing. So this is where even a good product or a service could fail, because they haven't understood the information you're offering, and they're not able to translate it to their functional requirement. So for example, if your product is a SaaS product which has multiple users that have to log in from various places to use it, the kind of information that you have to share with the functional person is to say that how will a typical user walk through this? Look at what requirements they have put out and package your information in such a way that it ticks off those requirements for them and maybe offers the USP that we are talking about. So this is the role and the responsibility we have seen so far. That is a requirement. You have to understand that, without which you're not going to move forward. But the most important thing here is there are people working there, and there are human beings there behind all of this processes and requirements and expert opinions and things like that. And here is the rubber meets the road here, and you'll make a sale based on how well this goes. So when you're meeting in person, a lot of times we think sales is about talking, but sales is about listening. And try and listen to understand, and not
Gayatri, we
always.
are at 3:45. The time is 3:45. We have.
Got it, yeah. You listen to understand and not always to respond. So often when we speak, we want to convince other people about our product or service. So we are always primed to say, but look at me. Yeah. Uh, but often the other person is giving you hints and clues, maybe consciously, maybe unconsciously. So listen to understand first. Prepare your core message for each person and role. So your core message may be that my solution actually helps your company. Please see it for the worth it is. It is great. It's of high value. The cost price is just right. So why don't you just buy it? But for each role, you may want to tailor that message, especially in conversation. And if you're listening to understand where they're coming from, this part becomes easier. Often it happens, right? So you go to a meeting. I've had this occasion where I've gone to a sales meet, and there is the user and the purchase department representative sitting there, and you don't get a positive vibe from one or the other, and you're like, We have already had 4 meetings, everything was going well. What's happening today? Don't take the responses personally. Each response has value and has value for you as a piece of very important information. It's got nothing to do with you on that day in a very general sense. So don't take it too personally. This is part of what is happening in the internal dynamic that we had earlier. Try to tap into the energy. When we talk about energy, we're not talking about how whether they have had a cup of coffee. It definitely helps, but the energy is what seems to drive them. So we talked about the dynamic of that, what's going on as a human being inside, right? So their motivations, it'll come out into in some of those conversations. You may get to know that, oh, I have been here, it's a new job for me, so then you know that they're still figuring out their role, their position in this organization. They may be talking about, I have been here as an expert for like 7 years. So ask a little bit deeper question as to what is their take in this purchase or in this buy. Again, this makes sense only if it is going to be like a big chunk of your sale and significant for them as well. And find other ways to engage. You may be talking only about the product or sale, but there may be other opportunities. There may be an upcoming conference, there may be a citywide art mela. Try and bring something to engage them to see what is going on behind the scenes as well, for them as people and for the organization. Offline connects, when a lot of people have been saying I can't reach people because nowadays meetings are not happening. So I thought this is important. Find a common platform or context. So here, in the industry space, there are a lot of things, initiatives people are talking about. I have had in the last few months people who are organizing conferences reach out. Try and participate or make connections for them, so that's some common platform that you can think of. A context right now, COVID relief is a fantastic shared platform to connect with people. And secondly is underline your expertise. If you are an expert in your product, if you're an expert in your service or domain, uh, do make presentations or material available where that expertise comes out. It can be in the way that your potential customer's customer will use your product. So that can be your expertise as well. Uh, they're possible, connect through referrals. Sometimes referrals actually open doors for you. This is a very well-known fact. And even when business is not happening, try and keep your offline connects going. Keep soft touches happening. Say hi, hello. Make some of those conferences. Organize some events if possible, if that is within your budget. Introduce potential clients or potential businesses to organizations such as CWE, where a lot of people gather. It's a great networking space. Okay, so we'll spend a few minutes on a couple of case studies that came up. And this is a food product. I have anonymized all the data. Just, I think the person who sent it will recognize. The food product, which is not very high priced, looking for B2B institutional buyers, has been established in Bangalore and has done white label sales to a lot of channels. So here, what is happening is they're looking for to breaking into new markets in Bangalore and outside the state as well. And they don't want to do the direct consumer sales because of the cost issues and the investments involved. So basically, the first thing that comes out is to do by other channel partners like distributors, because that takes care of the white labeling part. It also takes care of the low cost approach. Uh, and look at allied products. If your food sales and you're selling something, snacks, then perhaps look at allied things like cooling juices or ice creams, or what are the kind of other cooler related products that are distributors. And not just look at distributors going out of Bangalore, but look at distributors are coming into Bangalore with other products in their own home territories. How are they dealing with it? And perhaps that is one way of opening up markets. So you look at the two-way distribution network to help you break into other markets. Uh, the ITES, which is struggling into getting into international markets. This is currently the scenario is that reaching out long distance is an issue. Therefore, you have to establish some positive things. So narrow, make a niche market, something that it can even be something that is like only 2 or 3 firms exist. but showcase your product if you can connect with them. And if that is seems very difficult, then perhaps it's time to look at a digital campaign, because then you have to cast your net very wide. In when the distance between you and the customer and their end customer is a lot, you have to rely on interventions such as digital campaigns to make a buzz. If your product or service is found, there are many competitors and there are many other solutions on offer. Yeah, so time is of essence. Therefore, a digital campaign becomes a good way to open up markets there. So this is a tough one. How do I get to a CXO level decision maker? We talked about the influencer and the buyer. So here it looks like the final decision is the CXO. As they say, to hunt big game, you have to go to a watering hole. So what is the watering hole here for a CXO of that level? In the olden days, we used to say that go to golf courses or pubs, but may not always be true today, and given all the social distancing. But their roles require people to be present in public in various situations. So are there ways that you can reach? Is it possible to reach through the second in command, like the inside organization expert? So is it possible for people to connect there? Or a strategic advisor? So is there an university or a professor who's advising them on the technical matter? Is it possible to connect through them? Can you be the influencer or the SME subject matter expert, because you already understand the industry there very clearly? And this is a tried and tested method, is to hire an existing SME as a consultant. Oftentimes, that if you want to get into sports, you want to hire an ex superstar to understand the market and work with them. If you want to get into the entertainment industry, similarly, you work with people who have been there and who have done a lot of years of work there, and an expert may not necessarily be in front of the camera, but behind the camera as well. So similarly, hire an existing SME as a consultant. Tried and tested method, you may want to explore that. So that's it, folks. A short run through on B2B sales, how to capture and a cluster or your or target market, how to identify that, and how to present your sales once you identify that. So time is now open for questions on this. Let's move on.
Thanks, Gayatri. That was a really informative session. Gayatri, we have a question from Geetha Manjunath. Are there
Okay.
any strategies
Okay.
to follow in this if the end user whose pain point we solve is not a decision maker?
So you can solve a user's pain point, but that person is not the decision maker. Is that right? Am I understanding the question right? So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So in
Yes,
this
yes.
in this you'll
That
have to
person is
ask the
not the decision.
user to see how to break the decision maker. What is the decision maker looking for? Because it's in the user's interest to take you through the process. So this is called an internal champion. You have an internal champion. Make the internal champion work for you, and tell them that I can solve it for you, boss, but tell me, how do I reach your purchase department, or how do I reach your CXO, and have that person help you through the process.
Okay, okay. Any more questions? Anyone?
Yeah, so I had a question. Um,
Yes.
yeah, hi. Yeah, hi, Gayatri.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thanks for the
Yeah, Kanchan.
lovely session, Gayatri. So my question was, if you're doing B2B to C sales,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes one gets stuck at the business level, wherein people might act as gatekeepers,
Yes,
and
yes.
they might decide for the customers. So,
Mm-hmm.
what are the ways to get around that?
So, if tell me a little bit more in terms of, so I can give you a quick
Yeah,
an example.
so in my particular case, because I actually I'm a lending fintech, and
Mm.
my
Mm.
sales process is B2B to C. And I sometimes approach the HR managers or the facility managers, and that's where I seem to get stuck. I can't seem to go beyond the facility or the HR managers who don't even introduce me to their team. So
So I think that especially in a product or service which is not business critical, right? It is what you're talking about is not core business critical. This
right,
happens a lot, and that happens. I mean, that is a way. So how do I reach the C without the B? So how do you reach the C without the B is by getting into their. Can you where do they live? So it's if you're going through companies, then that is one gate. But there
right,
is also residential associations which will take you for webinars or seminars on financial services, and get into that as well. Uh,
right,
so that is one way of looking at it. The thing is, where do your customers come together? So are there clubs?
right,
Uh, Things like that. So that is one way of looking at it. How do you kind of connect to them in such a way that it solves somebody's problems? So can you present to the HR person or the facilities person to say that this is going to be free, people can come in, or some such way of making them the whole engagement seem like engaging their employees for their benefit. So
right,
therefore, yeah, so that is one way of looking at it. It is a tough situation. The B2B, B2C is, that's why I have not even touched upon that, because that the dynamics are much more.
right,
And yeah, but I find that the mix of uh, offering and presenting in such a way, and this is an iterative process. So maybe in July they said no, but in December they'll say yes. So
right,
that is something that you will have to try. But since your is not necessarily, you're not depending upon the HR person to get you numbers,
right,
you also independently can go to the Cs themselves, right?
right, right,
Yeah. So maybe partner with a tax company, people who do taxes,
right.
because that's the time people are looking at investments.
Uh-huh. Sure, sure.
Okay.
Thanks, Gayatri. Thanks, Kanchan. If you want to connect to Gayatri for a offline session, please do connect to us, and we can connect you to Gayatri. Also, Kanchan, so on this note, I would also like to thank Gayatri. Gayatri, that was the last question that
Sure.
we would
Sure.
take for today's session. And thank you so much. I hope all of you have benefited immensely from this session.